We talked a lot about body condition score, and that's going to impact performance of cattle when they're stressed in the cold or when those temperatures drop. You also talked about wind. So, do you want to talk about maybe some different options that ranchers can put into place to help help those cows perform better? I know when it's going to depend on where people have them. If you are out grazing stocks or if you have them closer to home or wherever it may be. So can you just share some tips and strategies there?
So wind can be a really hard thing on cattle, can really increase their nutrient requirements to just maintain their body temperature when the wind chill is really bad. But amazingly, if you can get them out of the wind, they can handle some pretty low temps, especially if they're in a decent body condition and they have some feed for them. So, shelter belts, tree strips are nice. Metal windbreaks that have been erected can certainly help cattle, have a place to come in, keep them from drifting. If you feed them where the windbreak is, a lot of times when we know there's a storm coming, we can feed them next to those windbreaks, and they're certainly going to utilize that. We've even done things where we put stacked the big square bales of straw, and 2 to 3 high in around a pen on the outside of the pen, just to make a temporary windbreak because a storm was coming in, and where these cattle were, they maybe didn't have the best one or whatever. The other thing to keep in mind, I don't know how many of your listeners have a fall calving herd, but those calves are a little more susceptible to the cold than a mature cow, and that particular cow is lactating. So now she does have that requirement for lactation on top of her maintenance, and she has that calf. And so I think a windbreak for them is even more critical because it allows them to get in a smaller area, share some body heat, protect them from the wind, makes your feed go a little farther for those cows if you happen to get in a storm like that. Some years, we don't have horrible storms, and some years they start in October.
And what about bedding for those mature cows?
So bedding can certainly help take that cold from the ground away from them and make that a little better. And I think especially with the pairs, that's very helpful to the calves. It can certainly help the dry spring calving cow as well. It's not going to hurt her, but it might be more critical for your bulls because the wintertime, when they are exposed to extreme cold for a length of time, which we can get into as well in the winter, that's when we can have a frostbite injury to the testicles, and then come spring that bull doesn't test, and that's very frustrating, and especially if we could have prevented that with some bedding and a windbreak.
Mm-hmm. So if producers know that a cold snap is coming, how should they be feeding their cattle differently leading up to that, if at all?
Well, it doesn't hurt to provide a little extra feed, maybe 20% more when you know it's fixing to snow and they're predicting a blizzard and that kind of thing. Because that heat of fermentation in the rumen helps produce heat to help those cows produce body heat to keep them at a decent comfort level during that storm. So increasing that can help. If you're doing a total mixed ration and you increase the feed a little bit, maybe you add a pound or two of corn per head per day or something, that could also be a way to add some energy, that kind of thing. It's important to keep in mind what happens sometimes is those cows are out there foraging for themselves on a cornstalk field, and say it's January or February, so the goodie in the cornstalk field is gone, so there's not much out there for them to eat, and they don't have a windbreak, and they're thinner than you realize because they've got a winter coat on, that kind of thing. That's when we can really get into a disaster. And then come spring, she gives birth to a calf, and she's thin, and she didn't put a lot of nutrients into the colostrum for that calf, and so the calf doesn't do that great, and then she's already so far behind the 8 ball that subsequent calf she doesn't come up bred with, And so the winter thing can be a snowball effect well into the spring that we don't often realize, that we're setting some things in motion that are going to hit us down the road because we're trying to save a few bucks here in the winter and make those cows do it on their own. And there's certainly something to be said for having cows that fit your environment. I'm not saying that we just need to feed the daylights out of everything, but if she can't meet her requirements and we get into some weather that increases that requirement, there can be a chain reaction to that down the road that we will eventually pay the price for.
Karla, what else haven't we touched on that you think is important to bring up today?
Well, the cow that gets wet with maybe it starts raining and then that turns to snow as the temperature drops or whatever. That cow struggles some to because her coat has gotten wet. Now she's chilled. And so watching that weather forecast, and that's definitely a time to make sure that we can provide them some windbreaks and that we can get some extra feed in them, because that's hard on them too. And, we've all seen those cows that are walking around with, they almost look like polar bears with little eye spots on them or whatever, and they look cold. And honestly, that's a good thing. Because what that tells us is that that coat and the fat layer beneath the coat is keeping the body heat in, and the snow is freezing on the coat, but the body heat is not leaking through that to then melt that snow, on that cow. And so, in fact, that cow's probably doing a lot better. She looks awfully cold to us, but she's doing pretty good because she's able to conserve that body heat. The cow that we need to really worry about is the cow that doesn't have much for a winter coat, doesn't have any body condition score, doesn't have any body fat to condition her against that, to save that. And then she's going to get wet and cold and fight the wind. And that cow's nutrient requirements can double. And so if we're still out there expecting her to forage around on a dormant winter range pasture or a cornstalk field, like she has a requirement for 8 pounds of TDN a day, and she's actually up to 13 or something, or 14, where she's supposed to get that. And if it's been a long winter and she has used those reserves and she's used those reserves, we get to February and we have a cold snap. In Nebraska, it's not uncommon for us to have a cold snap of, 30 or 40 degrees below zero. Obviously, cows in Montana, they live that way. And so, but they got to have the reserves to make it through that. And so if this cow is, was thin coming off of winter range, let's say coming out of weaning, she was thin. Snowstorms started early. There wasn't a lot of quality in the diet that she had. And she began to use those body reserves to get her through the November, December snowstorms and cold snaps. By the time we get to January and February, she has nothing left to give. And so then we're surprised because that cow goes down out there, or she, we all of a sudden realize she's in a body condition score 3 or whatever, and we're like, wow, what happened? Well, it didn't happen overnight, but it happened all winter.